In May of 1976, the Sex Pistols supported the Doctors of Madness at a gig at the Town Hall in Middlesbrough. The Doctors allegedly refused to allow the Pistols use of their sound equipment, and in retaliation, Pistols guitarist and semi-retired petty thief Steve Jones broke into the headliner's dressing room and swiped their wallets. This effectively shut down any negotiations Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren might have had with Polydor, the Doctors label, thus depriving A&R man Chris Perry of an early foothold in punk. McLaren's protege, Bernard Rhodes, was also shopping for a deal for the band he managed. He was able to catch Perry's attention, and in November '76, The Clash recorded a demo for Polydor which included Janie Jones, Career Opportunities, London's Burning, and White Riot. Included with the 2013 box set, the demo recordings feature strummers struggling to carefully enunciate each consonant for clarity. Polydor made The Clash an offer of £25,000. Rhodes took that offer across town to CBS, where he leveraged it into the now famous £100,000 contract. Polydor missed out again.
Right out of my hands.
Undeterred, Perry continued to attend shows in small clubs. By the end of 1976, there was no shortage of underground bands in Greater London. Acting on a tip from future Pogue Shane MacGowan, Perry found himself at the Marquee in London in January of 1977. Headlining the show was the past their prime, glam-influenced pub rock group Bearded Lady, playing their not-so-grand finale. But that's not why Perry was there. It was the opening act he was interested in, and despite the tepid crowd, Perry was enamored. Less than a month later, the A&R man signed the jam to Polydor Records. Hi everybody, Brendan here with another edition of This Month in Punk Rock History. It's February 2024, and this month in punk rock history, we take a look at the early days of the jam and the significance of the contract they signed on February 15th, 1977. But first...
You're watching the Sweet Jimmy Network. Please like, subscribe, and share. Want to support the channel? Check out our eBay store full of really great collectibles and antiques. Proceeds go to new equipment, because it's a shit show here.
As I said, by the end of '76 there was no shortage of underground bands. Some of the most important and influential groups, many of whom would go on to mainstream success, had already been formed, and a number of influential records had already been released. This hard, fast, stripped-down antithesis to the stale arena glam rock which dominated the mid-70s airwaves was without an agreed-upon name or even a defining sound. But it was different. It was new. And establishment record companies were tripping over each other to capitalize on anti-establishment.
Shut up and take my money!
The Sex Pistols and the Saints went to EMI. The Clash went to CBS, and United Artists had the Stranglers, Buzzcocks, and 999 in their stable. Polydor was losing the race, but not totally out of it yet. A&R boss Freddie Hine dispatched his scout Chris Perry to various small venue concerts throughout Greater London. Having had the Pistols and the Clash slip through his fingers, Perry was consoled by friend and seamster Shane MacGowan, who tipped Perry off to the Jam, a band he had seen a number of times and whom he declared fucking important in his fanzine, Bondage. If punk is about confounding expectations, the Jam were rebellion within rebellion. How many stories have you heard about punk bands starting after the individual members acknowledged their lack of skill? That was not the case with the Jam. Mark Perry of Alternative TV says he and his friends used to antagonize the Jam for tuning their instruments on stage before gigs. "That's not punk. We don't tune up," Perry would shout. The band that Perry discovered that night had already been playing since '74, with the embryonic stage of the group tracing back another 2 years. They had plenty of time to hone their playing, singing, and stage presence. Christmas Day, 1970. 12-year-old Paul Weller of Woking, Surrey, in southeast of England, awoke to find a guitar under the family Christmas tree. Over the next year or so, Weller sporadically fumbles around with it, and he kind of learns a few things. Then, he discovers girls. And he discovers girls like dudes with guitars. And he begins to take his playing a little more seriously.
I give...
Around the same time, Weller's friend Steve Brooks also takes up guitar while pondering his future. When Weller presents the idea of forming a music group together, Brooks likes this better than getting a proper job. The two began as sort of a Simon & Garfunkel-inspired folk duo, playing over their lunch period at Shearwater Comprehensive School's music room. Weller's father managed to get them their first sort of proper gig, also during their lunch period, at the nearby Albion pub. None of the afternoon punchers there really noticed. The duo learned how to plug in their guitars and discover the world of amplifiers. They added Shearwater's resident beatnik teenager Dave Waller on rhythm guitar so Weller could switch to bass. So what's in a name? According to Jam lore, it may have been Waller's mother who christened the heretofore unnamed group after hearing her son's repeated mentions of going to jam with the band. Drummer Rick Buckler, we didn't get to him yet, says people just started calling them that because of jamming at the school. It just stuck. But the most persistent legend is that the name came about at the Waller family breakfast table when Nikki Weller, sister of Paul, cited breakfast-inspired band names like Bread and Marmalade when she suggested the Jam. Whatever the case, it was the band's only name. There was no evolution or alteration. They were simply the Jam for the duration of the group's career.
And now, on with the show.
The next to join the group was drummer Neil Bomber Harris. A drummer since the age of 7, Harris completed the quartet, and with him setting the pace, they entered and won a local talent competition on Easter weekend of 1973, beating out local favorites Rock Island Line, who once had a song in a movie starring David Essex, Ringo Starr, and Keith Moon. As the curtain opened, the band stood with their backs to the crowd. Upon striking the first chord of their Chuck Berry cover, they did a jump turn to face the audience. It was clear they were more than just a band. They were performers. They left the competition with an engraved trophy and a cash prize. Then Harris spent the rest of his summer playing soccer in Canada, forcing him to miss their next gig and essentially getting kicked out of the band. They invited friend Paul Richard Buckler, who would later go by Rick, to fill in. The first proper gig with a full set, as friend Steve Baker recalls, was held at Shearwater YMCA. They set up early in the afternoon for a sound check, then put all their gear aside. With time to kill before the show, they hit the pub. Later, they returned no worse for the wear, and after a sound dressing down by Weller's dad, they stumbled onto the stage where they slurred through a number of rock and roll covers and a couple of original songs. Halfway through the set, Weller's guitar lead failed, so he pushed the piano from the side of the stage to the center, and the band carried on. There were no awards for their performance that night. It was the debut of the new lineup and the debut of 2 of the first original songs by the Jam: Blueberry Rock, which would be lost to the annals of history, and Taken My Love, a version of which would find its way to the B-side of their first single. Both of these were recorded at the Eden Studio for a demo tape, which would be circulated by Weller's dad. They began playing the working men's clubs and youth clubs throughout Woking, gradually incorporating original songs into their set. By the fall of '73, writes Steve Brooks, about 50% of their set was original material. Towards the end of the year, Waller quit the group. Ever the philosopher and poet, the beatnik's guitar skills were not improving, and so, according to Buckler, he was, quote, forced out. Waller published a book of his poetry in 1979 and was found dead in 1982 of a heroin overdose in a room above the Wheatsheaf Hotel, where the group often congregated for a night of drinking. The trio of Weller, Brooks, and Buckler carried on into 1974, which proved to be a pivotal year for the Jam. They obtained a residency at Michael's Club in Woking. The elder Weller stepped into his role as the group's manager, and band members themselves started to come into their own as musicians. The residency had them playing almost exclusively at Michael's through the first half of the year. In May 1974, Bruce Foxton was brought in to fill the void left by Waller. Foxton was another Shearwater student already acquainted with the Jam, but initially having no interest in joining them. Foxton had started his own band back in '72 with drummer Neil Bomber Harris, described in Foxton's and Buckler's book as a, quote, progressive garage band. They only managed to escape the garage twice, and it was clear they were going nowhere. Acting on a tip from their former drummer, the Jam offered Foxton an audition and subsequently a job as rhythm guitarist. He and Weller would soon swap places on stage, with Foxton on bass and Weller on rhythm guitar. This was also about the time when egos began to clash and fissures developed between band members as they accepted invitations to play just about anywhere: working men's clubs, youth clubs, children's parties, prison, weddings, you name it. If you lived in Woking and wanted a group to play your event, just call Mr. Weller and book The Jam. Remember Rock Island Line, who lost the Battle of the Bands in '73? They were playing a gig at Bunter's in Guildford, a place Foxton describes as, quote, a horrid discotheque. The Jam were booked in support. They arrived in the afternoon, set up, ran through a quick sound check, and had time to waste before their set. Foxton had arranged to meet friends at a nearby pub. That was October 5th, 1974. The pub where they were to meet was called the Horse and Groom. It was one of 2 pubs destroyed in timed explosions resulting from bombs planted by the Provisional IRA. 5 people were killed, many more were injured. The gig, of course, was cancelled. Foxton found out the next morning that his friends escaped through a shattered window without injury. IRA attacks notwithstanding, and there will be more, the group carried on gigging as much as possible around the greater Woking area. In November '74, they opened for Thin Lizzy at the Croydon Greyhound. This was their first major gig, even though it was an opening slot. Foxton recalls the headliners being very accommodating and encouraging of the teenagers. It was a smaller show, though, in February 1975 that netted the group their first brush with the major label. Sheila Slater, wife of EMI publishing boss Terry Slater, attended a local parent association dance at the Hindhead Royal British Legion Club. The band and of course their manager, Mr. Weller, found themselves chatting with Mrs. Slater after the show. She later passed along John Weller's card to her husband, who agreed to check out the band.
There was John with the boys, sat on these spindly stools, with their little amplifiers. They played some blues songs, and a bunch of Beatles things, not much original material. I really liked them. I thought they had a lot of energy. We had a Coca-Cola and I drove home.
Ultimately, Slater was unable to get them a contract, but the attention gave them some confidence and a push to take themselves more seriously. The younger Weller had a sort of transformative experience in January 75, witnessing Dr. Feelgood perform at Guildford Civic Hall. The concert inspired Weller to nudge his music in a new direction, incorporating an intensity into the group's Everly's-esque performance. Weller was also struck by Feelgood's guitarist Wilco Johnson, dressed in a sharp black suit and constantly moving about the stage. Around this time, Weller also discovered The Who's My Generation. He told podcaster Dan Jennings that up until this discovery, he had been a Suede head, and although he doesn't remember exactly how he first came across the song, it changed everything for him.
So I hadn't heard My Generation. When I heard that on this compilation I bought, right, I just thought, fuck, that's just so amazing. So when I went up to Rock On, there's a little song called Rock On, Ted Carroll and Roger Armstrong used to run it. The Who album there, My Generation there, and I bought the Artwoods album as well. So a few kind of moddy things, and then I just thought it was the most amazing sound, but it was the look more than anything anyway. And I think that come from either a picture like I saw in like either the NME or I don't know, a magazine or whatever. That's fucking great, man. But it rang a bell with me anyway. It was kind of like, I kind of know that look, but I don't know it. That was the start of it for me, and then there was a magazine called The History of Rock. But anyway, they had a great mod issue, great pictures in it. Bit by bit, I just tried to find wherever I could. I tried to find photos, information, whatever. And then I got a scooter as well. I bought my GP around about 75, I think it was 76. And that was it for me, really. I've never looked back since.
It wasn't long after Weller's mod epiphany that he and co-founder Steve Brooks began to drift apart. Brooks objected to the fashion as well as the musical direction toward which Weller was steering the group. Brooks decided to leave. Sometime later, Weller called Brooks to offer an olive branch as the EMI was supposedly willing to give them a second look, but only as a four-piece. Brooks declined. This rejection caused a rift between the two that would last for about 2 decades. For what it's worth, Terry Slater denies any knowledge of EMI's renewed interest. It was now the summer of 75, and the jam consisted of Paul Weller, Rick Buckler, and Bruce Foxton, the lineup that would remain until their breakup in 1982. An ad was placed seeking a new guitarist, and a man called Pete Jessup was chosen to replace Brooks. According to John Reed's book, though, Jessup neglected to show up at any gigs, and the jam was forced to carry on as a trio. The Foxton and Buckler book recalls Foxton's diary saying, quote, "Well, Pete Jessup, cheers, mate. We are very annoyed about the whole situation." Annoyed indeed. While much of the interpersonal tension among the group was relieved by Brooks's exit, some band-wide issues remained. Questions arose about the band's finances. Foxton and Buckler interrogated their manager about what they felt they should have gotten paid for previous gigs. The older Weller took umbrage at what he perceived as accusations while doing his best to explain that any profits accrued by the band were sunk right back into the band. The hot-headed frontman, of course, sided with his dad, and the jam's rhythm section quit. The elder Weller wasted no time in securing replacements for his son's group, while Foxton and Buckler toyed with the idea of starting their own group. Weller's significantly older backing band didn't quite mesh with the 17-year-old, and the manager offered a conciliatory call to his ex-clients, brokering a peace deal. The next year and a half was a blur of pubs, clubs, and late nights, writes John Reed, as the jam tried to break out of Surrey, torn between solid earnings playing covers to indifferent audiences in Woking, and the chance to pursue their art and reach a wider audience in the capital. The jam would spend any free nights outside of rehearsal or gigs fly-posting London with handmade leaflets printed by Foxton at his day job. They secured occasional spots at the Greyhound and a few one-offs at places like Hope and Anchor and Windsor Castle, but they continued to struggle. Then came Weller's second epiphany. NME journalist Neil Spencer called them, quote, "a quartet of spiky teenage misfits playing 60s-styled white punk rock." They were, of course, the Sex Pistols. Weller had read Spencer's review and gathered some friends for a pilgrimage to the Lyceum, where they witnessed Johnny Rotten extinguish a cigarette on the back of his hand. Weller saw through the facade and noticed the similarities between this new thing called punk and his recently discovered mod. Weller recalls the experience.
And it just changed us all, you know. And then after I saw the Pistols, and then I went to see them and the Clash as well at the 100 Club. And then my writing changed. I mean, I was just probably just trying to mimic what I was hearing, I suppose. So things like In the City was the first big sort of tune for me. And I can distinctly remember us rehearsing that song in Shearwater Youth Club. I'd just written it and we rehearsed it, and we sort of really got it together, and just thought it's just so good. And it was kind of like this is our new direction now.
In 1976 London, the punk movement was in full swing, and the highly influential music press was quick to call anything that wasn't accompanied by a massive lighting rig and billowing smoke punk. Whether the Jam was punk or not is a long-standing debate that seems to have been unsettled within the group itself from the beginning. Buckler told Negative Reaction fanzine in 1977, quote, "We're not a punk band. The papers put down the word punk. We just happen to play on the same circuit as the rest of them." But punk rock scholar Matthew Worley quotes Weller, who in 1979 told NME, quote, "We're a punk band. We started as a punk band, and that's where we're staying."
Gatekeeper.
Whether they identified as punk or not was really irrelevant, as they were part of that scene, and they were keenly aware of this. They knew that simply playing clubs in London wasn't going to yield the success they were after, so they baited the music press by staging an outdoor performance at London's Soho Market in October 1976, just before the debut of their new keyboardist.
What you talking about, Willis?
Yes, they had a keyboardist, for a little while anyway. Only days after the aforementioned Sex Pistols show, an ad appeared in various music magazines. The Jam were seeking a keyboard player. In a 1977 interview with Negative Reaction fanzine, Hoxton cites the influence of Small Faces for the decision to bring in the fourth.
I close my eyes and drift away.
Bob Gray was another Shearwater student. He spent much of his teen years bouncing between England and Canada. He was friends with Bruce Foxton, who he says asked him to take up the keyboards. Gray tells fan website The Jam Archive, "After a couple of weeks' rehearsals, we went into an 8-track studio to record 3 songs. Together, they played 3 gigs. They opened for the Sex Pistols in Dunstable, they supported the Vibrators at the 100 Club, and played a set upstairs at Ronnie Scott's." Gray says he left the band because he just wasn't into the London music scene, and he preferred to stay in Canada anyway. There were no hard feelings, as the rest of the band admitted this experiment was a failure, to be relegated to the footnotes of Jam history. Lest we think this foursome completely ignored, they caught the attention of one Shane MacGowan, aka Shane O'Hooligan. Long before he was a pogue or even a nipple erector, MacGowan could be found at the front of the crowd at various OG punk band performances. In 1976, he caught the attention of photographer Red Saunders, whose picture of a bloody-eared MacGowan was published in the NME under the headline, "Cannibalism at Clash Gig." That year, he also published issue number 1 of his fanzine Bondage, which featured a review of a recent Jam gig. MacGowan makes reference to the group's previous inclusion of a keyboard player and calls the group, quote, "fucking important." The secret to A&R success is to make friends with the scenesters. So Polydor's Chris Perry spent a lot of his time and expense account buying drinks for the young punk fans. One night, Perry bought a drink for young MacGowan, who, as Perry recalls, informed him of a band playing the Marquee that Saturday and invited the label rep to check them out. A tip from Shane was worth doing, he told podcaster Dan Jennings, so that's exactly what I did. But Polydor wasn't the only label sniffing around. We already covered their flirtation with EMI. They were considered and rejected by Decca. Indie label Chiswick courted the Jam over a period of several weeks spanning the end of '76 and into early '77. Chiswick knew they couldn't compete with the majors, their pockets just weren't that deep. A good faith gesture of £500 and the use of a PA was made. After the gig at the Marquee, John Weller met with Chiswick co-founder Ted Carroll in his apartment above his Rock On store in Camden. He informed Carroll that the Jam would be signing with Polydor. "We nearly signed the Jam," says Chiswick's other co-founder Roger Armstrong. "We had a studio holding time to record in the city. When I got around to Ted's flat, he said, 'They've just cancelled. They're signing to Polydor this afternoon.'" Harry quickly secured his own studio time, scheduling the Jam for Anemone Studios in London. They were unable to access the studio, however, as the entire neighborhood was effectively shut down. It was January 29, 1977, and a series of 7 IRA-planted bombs exploded in central London. Scotland Yard had cordoned off a 2-mile radius around Oxford Street. A week later they returned, and with engineer Vic Smith and soon-to-be producer Chris Perry in the control room, they recorded In the City, Time for Truth, Sounds from the Street, and I've Changed My Address. It had been well known in certain circles that the singer's dad was their manager and that he didn't really know what he was doing. In Foxton's book, Alex Ogg writes, John Weller was clearly out of his depth when it came to handling the record company. The elder Weller reportedly didn't even want to read the contracts. He was just eager to have his boys sign them. Brian Morrison, who secured publishing rights, says he even recommended they seek legal advice, and they declined. On February 15, 1977, Perry signed the Jam for £6,000 at a 6% royalty rate. They jumped at the first major label offer they received, where the Pistols signed up to give EMI 2 albums in 2 years, and CBS swept up the Clash with £100,000 for 10 records. The Jam seized upon a £6,000, 1 single, and a label option for an album deal. Perry says that's all he could get out of Polydor. They were still uncertain of this new punk scene. Once more, their manager showed his amateur status when he was presented with a check but didn't know what to do with it. The band never established any kind of bank account, and neither did the individual members. Weller asked Perry for the sum in cash. Perry made necessary arrangements with Polydor Brass, and the two went to the bank together. Weller was handed a large envelope.
We happy? Yeah, we happy.
10 days later, Polydor announced the signing. Terry Slater, who you may recall was not able to get them a contract 2 years prior, sent them a congratulatory telegram. Shortly after the signing, Perry hooked them up with a lawyer and an accountant. John Weller spent £1,200 on what is described in the Foxton book as, quote, a totally inappropriate PA.
That was ridiculous.
Paul Weller stocked up on new Rickenbacker guitars, including the semi-hollow 330, which would become crucial in the Jam's unique sound. Perry wasted no time getting his newly signed punk group back into the studio. This time, they were at Polydor's Stratford Place studios. In the midst of a recording session, before work on the first single was even complete, Perry informed the band that Polydor picked up the option for the album. Polydor was convinced that they signed the right group. The new lawyers negotiated a 4-year, 4-album deal with 13% royalties.
It's all right. That's in every contract. That's what they call a sanity clause. You can't fool me. There ain't no sanity clause.
They played the Red Cow, the 100 Club, the Roxy, and they recorded a Peel session, all before April 29, 1977, when the Jam's first single, In the City, backed with Taking My Love, hit stores. It was voted NME's Single of the Week and quickly made its way to number 40 in the singles chart. After the release of the single, they very briefly joined the Clash's White Riot tour with the Slits. Technical issues and interpersonal issues led to the Jam jumping ship after just 3 gigs. They became the first of this generation to play BBC TV's Top of the Pops.
In the city!
And their debut album was released on May 20th. Contemporary reviews praised these records. NME and Melody Maker invoke comparisons of The Who and The Kinks while praising the young punk attitude. Similar reviews in Trouser Press, The Village Voice, Record Mirror, and countless others describe the music as, quote, hurried, bleak, chaotic, and intense. Modern retrospective reviews continue to praise the mod punk trio's debut. The Jam did more to celebrate rather than bemoan their musical influences than did any of their peers. They rejected bondage trousers and spiky hair in favor of sharp suits and a clean-cut image while accurately espousing the anger and angst of their English working-class suburban adolescence. Like their contemporaries, they inspired countless others. In the Andrew Collins penned Billy Bragg memoir, Billy recalls a connection with the Jam that failed to materialize with the other groups at that time. Billy found himself plugging into something he really related to with Paul Weller's Woking-based mob, writes Collins. Toy Dolls frontman Olga says, my first punk gig was the Jam at the Seaburn Hall in Sunderland in 1977. I was blown away. 2 white spotlights, 3 guys in black suit and ties playing great songs as fast as hell doing their Pete Townsend jumps. I love it, even though I hate Paul Weller now. Less than a month after the Jam's full-length debut came out, the Sex Pistols were in the studio recording their single, Holidays in the Sun.
You're in the studio. These places cost like 50 grand a minute.
The song which unabashedly borrows from the Jam's In the City. Paul Weller and Sid Vicious famously had a dust-up about this. Weller, however, recalls the fight wasn't really about the Pistols lifting the riff, it was simply Sid Vicious being Sid Vicious. As the story goes, Vicious pushed Weller up against the wall outside the Speakeasy Club in London. He just came up to me and he was going on about Holidays in the Sun, where they'd nicked the riff from In the City, Weller told Uncut Magazine in 2007. I didn't mind him nicking it, you've got to get your ideas from somewhere, haven't you? Anyway, he just came up and nutted me, so I returned it. Details vary, but there was a glass involved, and the event ended with Sid Vicious in the emergency room. Weller had a well-earned reputation as a hothead. Paul spat fire at everyone, writes Paolo Hewitt, sometimes for the flimsiest of reasons. I've always been like that, he says in Paolo Hewitt's book. It's my own arrogance. Chris Perry was responsible for signing Susie and the Banshees to Polydor in June 1978. They were the last of the first class to get a contract. 3 months later, in September 1978, Perry was about to launch his own imprint, starting with another suburban trio of angsty young musicians. The Cure became the first band signed to Perry's Fiction Records. So that's it for our look at the genesis of the Jam. Corrections, comments, insights, and info always welcome. Who would have thought they narrowly avoided not one but 2 bombings? Jimmy and I have to take the next month off to deal with real-world stuff, so join us in April for a look at the album that nearly broke Epitaph Records. In the meantime, revisit last March's video about the St. Patrick's Day Elks Lodge Massacre, and dig through my archives via TIPRH.start.page. For this month in punk rock history, I'm Brendan McCabe.
Who are you? Cast your eyes across my portrait yonder. My God, you're Paul Weller. No, the next one along. Bruce Foxton. The next portrait along. Montgomery Flange. Ah, at your service.